Good morning, Rethink Church. You guys made it to church this morning. My name is Abby, and I'm one of the leaders here. And I have a couple announcements for you guys this morning. You guys can have a seat. First of all, if you are new or visiting with us this morning, we want to give you a gift for being here over at Guest Services. So stop by over by the One Cup Cafe after the service. We'd love to get to know you a little bit better and answer any questions you might have and connect with you that way. Or if you would prefer to connect virtually, you can text the word here to 219-233-2311. We connect with you that way as well. So we're glad to have you here this morning. As we're going into the school season, I wanted to make a note of those maps that are in the hallway next to the door. You might have seen those as you came in and wondered what those were. Those are actually our prayer walking maps. So we just want to encourage you guys to go out into the community this week. Pray over your streets, pray over the schools specifically this week as kids are starting school or maybe had recently started school. And as you do that, if you're praying in Maryville, come back and just mark those streets that you prayed through, because we really believe that prayer has power. And if we track it, we'll see God starting to change those areas that we're praying over. So it's just a visual representation of what God is about to do in this community through your prayers. So be sure to do that this week. And then I just want to talk a little bit, as we're going into our tithes and offering, about one of the things that we really value here at Rethink Church. When Mark, Heather, and I started this church a few years ago, one of the groups that we decided that we really are passionate about and wanted to pray for was our schools and our children. So we prayed and we felt like God was asking us to adopt a school, so we adopted MIS, and we've been able to serve over and over at that school. We've been able to bring donut holes to families on the first day of school, love on our teachers with special coffee drinks or snacks or lunches. We were able to teach these kids how to get into lockers for the first time, which can be kind of intimidating. This week we got to serve at the welcome station at the parent university. So it's been really fun to invest in that school, but also to just pray for our schools and pray for our students and to see the results of those prayers. Around this room today, there is a large percentage of educators or administrators in the schools. The Lord is giving us ways into the schools to bring the light of Christ to these children and bring the hope that we carry with us as believers. And so He is really answering those prayers, and it is just incredible to see that direct impact of what we've decided to pray for, God's faithfulness in that. And it's not just MIS. I mean, we get to invest in our students other ways. You know, we got to send them to camp with the gifts that you gave this year. And this year, some of those students came back and they're like, you know what, we're gonna commit to praying for our high school every single week. And I believe that we're going to see God work in many ways that way too. So I'm excited to come up here a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and just to continue to see God's faithfulness through your prayers and your gifts. So thank you guys for that. And if you do want to give to the vision and mission of Rethink Church, there's two ways you could do so. You can either give in person, we have a black box by the door, or you can give online at rethinkchurch.cc. We're really glad to have you guys here this morning. So enjoy as we move into the next phase of our sermon series.
And maturing your relationship with Jesus. And maybe some people who've given up on church, maybe they've been hurt by church, and they're like, hey, you know, we used to go to church, but we don't know why we stopped going, but we stopped going at some point. And so we just said, hey, what if we actually came back and moved here and helped people find their way back to faith, or faith in general in the first time. And so this is why we started our church. And it's one of those moments of, there's these parables of, don't despise the small beginnings. And so we were like, well, I don't think we're ready yet, but we're just going to do it. And so we launched in 2017. And we just can't wait to see back, look back and say, okay, we have no clue what changed Maryville in the surrounding areas. But the only thing we can tie it back to is these small little group of people got together, worshiped Jesus on Sunday mornings at Rethink Church, and started living this out and stuff like that. And we talk about this all the time when I say, let's go be the church, because we have to recognize this. Now we have like an hour here, but then I don't know if you've ever done the math, but there's 167 hours outside of this 1 hour. So what does it look like to be the church? Like being the church means that we actually get to go out and do this, and so we get to like have a random acts of kindness. We get to like be a good neighbor, love on people. I have to be extra generous when we tip our waiters and wait staff, because that's necessary, right? Like you have no clue what all that stuff really does, and so that's one way we do that. In our service, we've been very intentional about. We've been journeying through this gospel according to Matthew for about over 2 years now. And we're going into a new chapter, so you're like, yeah, we're finally getting there, right? Like, once again, we don't know how long we'll be in this chapter, so brace yourselves, it'll be okay. And so we're in Matthew chapter 24. So if you have the Bibles, you can turn there, or you can open it up, however you get to Matthew. However you read the scriptures, we'll be in Matthew 24. And we're not going to read the whole thing because it's a long chapter, but we're going to be there for a while, a couple weeks at least. So I'll read a good chunk of it and we'll go from there. But as you guys are getting there, I just wanted to have a confession time with you. I don't know if you noticed this, but I don't watch the news. So when people come up to me and say, hey, did you see or did you read? I'm like, no. If it wasn't on the Babylon Bee, which is like a satire news source, I didn't read it. And in fact, most of the time, Heather's like, you can't repost that because that's way too offensive, or stuff like that, which it is most of the time. But it's okay, it's fine, right? Like, it's a Christian-based thing. So, but what I have noticed, as I've observed, especially in the last 2 election years, that there's this whole, and COVID and all that, there's this like massive pendulum swing of like news readers, or whatever you want to call them. Like, there's some people who are like me who are very apathetic to one side of it. They're like, whatever, we just, what's the point of me watching the news? There's no real news, it's all propaganda, so why watch it and stuff like that. And then almost, like, this is the scary part. Like, it's almost in the middle that there's some people who are obsessed with the news. Like, they watch it all the time. And it's very scary to think that that's the middle ground of this pendulum swing, right? But then you have this other group of people, and they're like on the weird side of like, everything's a conspiracy theorist. And then they're like, hey, sign up for my newsletter, and I'm going to send you all this stuff, and like, here's the prophecy end times, and like, here's how this whole COVID vaccine plays into, the Antichrist and all this, like, seriously, be quiet, right? Like, when they come, but they're like, if you love Jesus, then you'll send me $10 a month, you'll sign up for my newsletter, and all that. It's very scary to think that we live in a world that the people who are obsessed with the news are the middle ground. But that's where we're at, right? Like, we just like, I don't know how, like, somebody in a dental office or something who has to sit there and do their job and watch the news in, like, the waiting room. Like, how do they do their job, and how do they not lose their mind watching CNN or ABC, whatever the news channels are, all the time, right? So, but there's this reality that that's the pendulum swing, and I'm probably, like, one step away from apathetic, just because I could lose my mind all the time. I just don't. So, like, once again, when you guys come up to me and say, hey, did you read or did you see? Not really. And I don't lie to you, so I just tell you no, right? Like, that's a good conversation starter. And you're like, great, we have a pastor who doesn't care about the current events. Pretty much. You're welcome. And it's not that I don't care, it's just that I don't care. Just put it that way. So there's that reality of it. But when I read Matthew 24, I was like, oh, I should probably start caring a little bit, right? Because you read Matthew 24, and you're like, there's all these events that are like lacing themselves in here. And you see this, and it's like this chapter, and if you read it outside of its context, you can make it say whatever you want it to say. And you can make it appear to be something that it may or may not be. So let's put ourselves in this perspective. We've shown this picture before. Here is it's a replica of the Temple Mount. It is half the football size. This is just, the Temple Mount itself is half the field of a football field to replicate the temple. This is in Jerusalem University. You can go there and see it. And so you see this massive area. You see the red roof area. This is where Jesus throws he clears the temple. And he does this thing when he comes into the Passion Week. And he does that under that red roof area. And then the massive temple thing. On the complete opposite side, just see where that arrow is. That's a Roman outpost that was not built originally by Herod when he built his temple. And by the way, like Solomon's temple was even bigger than this. Think that's this kind of idea, right? Well, the Roman Empire, they decided to put a garrison right there. That's what that arrow is. So that if the Jewish people got out of control in the temple, they could just send their troops in and be like, we're good, we're going to squash it. So, now when we say the temple, we, like, as Americans, we have a little misunderstanding of what the temple would be, right? The temple, to a Jewish person, especially in Jesus' day, is like the national cathedral, the national monument, and the national treasury all wrapped in one. Like, if you read through the scriptures and you see where they say the temple tax, like that wasn't just paid in Jerusalem at the temple, that was paid by any male who would go to a synagogue and pay the temple tax. And if you know history, there's a point where like the Jewish people leave, and it's called the diaspora, and they literally just go start like living in Ephesus, they live in Corinth, they live in all these other places. And the temple guard would go from Jerusalem throughout the whole Roman Empire and pick up the temple tax, and then they would travel back to Jerusalem. So this is where the treasury comes in. This is where like you paying all your temple tithes and taxes and all that starts to build up. And so by the time that Jesus is around, Israel's been ruled for 700 years by other people. We talk like you talk about from the Babylonians to the Assyrians to the Greeks, if you look at history, and there's a few decades with the Maccabees that kind of like lead up the revolt, like, hey, we're like independent, and then Rome's like, man, you're not, so we're gonna rule you. So we're gonna throw you flags and stuff like that. But here we are. And so you look at this for 700 years. Think about how Americans would respond for 700 years if we were ruled by other people. Like, would we just be like, oh yeah, this is cool, we're good. Police tax is 80 to 90% of our time. You know what I mean? Like, and all that. Do you think there'd be little skirmishes? Do you think there'd be like little fights and battles here and there throughout the whole time? Or would Americans be like, yeah, we're good? Now Canadians, that's a whole different story. But Americans, I think we'd have some like level of fight to us, right? Like we probably, like it's not maple syrup and all that all the time. Like we want to, like, American, so we just do this. So imagine Israel, who's like very, very proud of being Israel, right? And so they do this. And so throughout the time of Jesus' time, there's all these little battles. There's like the beginnings of a war coming, right? So now with this in mind, let's read Matthew chapter 24. We'll start at verse 1, because that's where you normally start, right? So, not that we do that all the time here, but we're going to start here. Here's what Jesus says. He said, in Matthew 24 says this: Jesus left the temple and was walking around away when his disciples came up to him and called his attention to the buildings. Like, holy cow, look at how great these buildings are, look how amazing this is, stuff like that. Verse 2. And he said, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, that not one stone will be left on one another. Everyone will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on Mount of Olives, so they've walked away from the temple, now they're into the Mount of Olives, and he says to the disciples privately, they ask him privately, tell us, they said, when will all these things happen? And what are the signs of the coming age, the age to come? So, how many questions were asked? 2, right? When will this happen, and what are the signs to come? So Jesus is going to give them 2 answers, because that's what happens, right? When you ask 2 other questions, you're going to get 2 answers. So the problem is, he just gives like the longest answers in the world. Like verse 4 through 35 is his answer for question number 1. It's a lot of words to say, right? Like it was like, hey, when's this going to happen? And he's like, I'll tell you. And then verse 36 all the way to 51 is how he responds to question number 2. And we'll get that at some point. But think about it, that's a lot of words to answer very simple questions, right? Like he never answers questions very directly. It's never just like, hey, yeah, here's like, what's the sky? The sky's blue. He doesn't say that. He's like, let's talk about this, like all that other stuff. He just like rambles, it feels like at times. And if you look at the words that he says here, we'll break it down later on. It appears that Jesus has his feelings hurt from Matthew 23, and now he's calling curses down on Jerusalem. Like if you read the whole thing, Jesus has been in this conversation with 3 different kinds of people, right? Matthew 23, we talked about this, that he's talking with feelers, he's talking with fakes, and he's talking with followers. The feelers are the people who are there exploring Jesus. They've heard all the rumors, they're like, hey, this is it. then he addresses his words to the fakers, the people who say that they follow Jesus, but they don't do anything, they just have all the right answers. And then you know a follower by a follower, they may not know all the right answers, they may not know all the right words, but they're putting the words of Jesus into practice. So when he says, hand your enemy a glass of water, they actually do it. When he says, hey, if you have 2 cloaks or 2 tunics, and like somebody's in need, hand them your extra. Like they actually do those things. They probably couldn't tell you all the prophecies and all the Hebrew scriptures and all that, but they know, okay, well, this is what Jesus says to do, so we just do it. That's how you know a feeler, a fake, or a follower. Is somebody actually putting the words of Jesus into practice. So, if you ever want to self-evaluate yourself, like, hey, am I a fake or am I a follower? That's how you know. So, Jesus, he's in this conversation with the religious leaders, and he's trying to get their attention because he understands something is coming. And he ends Matthew 23 by saying this, like, hey, he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I was trying to collect you like a hen would collect its chick, or her chicks under her wing. But you refused to come to me. And then he gets into this conversation. Right? Like, he's not calling down curses. He's not like his feelings are hurt, so he's just like, forget it, like, you're all done, we're going to kill you all. That's not what he's saying. He's like, I see this war coming, and I want to protect you. But you're refusing to come to me. He's like, you're not going to win this war, basically. The temple is going to be destroyed. Now, what do you do about it, right? And as we read this, it seems as if like these are going to be back-to-back events, right? It seems like the destruction of the temple is coming, and then the end of the age is going to be here. It looks like that, right? I don't know if you ever driven through like mountains, but when we were taking our students to South Carolina for camp, we saw pictures like this, or images like this, where we see these mountain ranges, right? Now, if you look at these, the mountain ranges seem to be very close together, right? But if you ever driven through them, if you ever like ride a bike through them, is there distance between the ranges? A lot, right? So as you get there, and it's amazing to me, as we like slow down, you feel the more of the elevation, right? Like if you're driving it, you feel like, man, there's some elevation there. Good thing I have, not a smart car. Like whenever time I see a smart car on the highway, by the way, in the mountains, I'm like, really? Like, can you get on the bike path? How about that? Because you're in the mountains. But anytime you mountain bike in there, you feel that a little bit more, don't you? And if you run it, you feel a whole lot more. You're like, what the heck? When I was training for on 25K, I had a 15-mile loop that I would run in Battle Creek, and there's this one time, like every ending of our training runs, I would run up this massive hill, and it just like, it was right by our house. And I could feel it every single time. And that's what it kind of feels like. You're just like there, right? But if you notice, like if you've ever hiked through these mountains or any mountains like this, you know that just because they appear to be back to back doesn't mean that they're there. There's some distance to them, right? So here's how he answers that. And he talks about this, stuff like that. So he says this. He says that the destruction is coming, and then there's going to be the end of this age. Right? And if you look at verse 33, I just want to jump to there really quickly here for a second, because there's something to be said about how he responds. He says this, even so, when all these things happen, you know that it is near. It's right at the door. Some of your translations may not say it, may say he is near. And Bible nerds have a massive debate about is it or is it he? And we don't have time to get into the implications of like if it's a he or if it's an it and all of that. But here's what we need to know. When you see all these things coming, when you see all this happening in Jerusalem and destruction of Jerusalem and stuff like that, like don't run back, get your cloak, just grab your crap and go to the hills. Something is near, right? Whether it's the he or it or whatever it is, don't waste your time. And what he's saying here is this. Like, it's not enough to be apathetic. You can't just be ignored, right? Like, you should pay attention to the signs of the times and all this. But notice what he doesn't say. Become obsessed with it. He says something very, very clear here. He says it in verse 13. We'll get into it in a second. He says to make sure that you stand your ground. But don't be so apathetic that you ignore all the signs. See, like, I think he's talking to me because I ignore all the signs. I'm like, oh yeah, I should probably pay attention, right? I should probably just be aware of things and probably not just, like, I have been getting into the cycle of, like, when I see the Babylon Bee and their postings, I actually do some research to be like, is this a joke? Is this a real news source? And I'm like, oh. And this last 18 months, I'll be honest, there are a lot where, like, the Babylon Bee was more accurate than news sourcing. Like, that's how scary this last 18 months were. And that the jokes were actually more accurate than some things. So, I don't know about you, but how do you respond when you see the events of the last 18 months? Like, you know where you find yourself, right? Do you become apathetic? Do you become obsessed? Do you start your own little blog that's like conspiracy theorists and sign up for my like subscriptions, like to subscribe and all that? Like, how do you actually navigate yourself through this? See, I think what Jesus is trying to get us to understand, he's not giving us like the timeline of all these events. He's actually trying to give us how we followers of Jesus should respond. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, we talked about this when we were teaching through this. The Sermon on the Mount was the ethics of the kingdom. Like, this is how Jesus expects his followers to live. Not like in the kingdom to come, but like now, right? This is how we should live in this world right now. We turn our other cheeks. We are meek. We are seeking him. We are like sorrowful for our sins. Like all of those things. Like that's how we live this life out, right? And if you look at Matthew 24, in my opinion, what he's trying to get us to understand is when the world goes to hell in a handbasket, when everyone loses their cool, how should the followers of Jesus respond? Do we become apathetic? Do we become obsessed? Or what else do we do? And I think this is what he's trying to get us to understand. He's giving us pastoral wisdom, prophetic advice of how we should respond to this. Because every single generation has seen the cycle of everything that Jesus lays out in Matthew 24. Think about that. Every single generation has seen the signs of the end of the age. It's in every, like, and by the way, when we talk about generations in the biblical terms, we're talking 40 years. So every 40 years it's been repeating itself. Does that mean it's not coming? No. It just means that every single generation has seen these signs, right? So, how do we respond? What does that look like? Question number one, when will this happen? Jesus says within one generation. He gives us an answer. And it's in 37 years after this. That Rome comes in with General Titus and literally destroys all of Jerusalem. And like annihilates and just wipes out the temple. And then they take the news back to Rome and they tell the story of it. And they celebrate it. And they throw like a huge party as it happens. So that's that answer. And then question number two, if you read through verse 36 through 51, here's the bottom line. Jesus is like, nobody knows. Nobody knows when this is going to happen. Not even me. I was officiating a funeral a couple weeks ago, and I was in Illinois area. And this guy came up to me and was like, hey, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask him this question. Like, basically, why do you make mosquitoes? Because you're outside and we're getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. And I was like, awesome. And then, like, this other guy came up to me and he was like, hey, Reverend. And I was like, oh, shut up, please. And he was like, I think I'm going to, when I get to heaven, and I'm going to ask God this. And after, like, the third person saying this, I was like saying, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this. And I was just like, actually, will you? Like, think about this. Like, do you think you're going to walk up to the God of the universe and just ask whatever question you want to ask him? Or are you going to just be in awe of his presence? Because of how holy, how divine, how just out of this world that he is. And at that moment, do you think the mosquito question matters? Think like, and if you ask him that question, is he entitled to give you an answer? And he just stared at me, and I was like, I know, it's like pretty deep for a funeral, but I just want you to think that through. And I have no clue who you are either, so. But he did like the White Sox, so it made me feel better that I was going back and forth with him, I'll put it that way. So, and he rooted for Green Bay, and I was like, so I don't feel bad for you. So, anyway, so as we started talking through this, here's the reality of it. Just because you have a question doesn't mean you're going to get an answer from God. Do you think Jesus deserves to know that answer? But he doesn't, right? Like, Like you would think that he would deserve to have the ability to have those answers, but yet he doesn't. And so there's something that we need to understand, that there's aspects of God is God, and we're not. And that may make us feel uncomfortable, that may make us feel something else other than like awesome, but that's a reality of life. And there's that part of this relationship and that faith journey that we just continually walk through, that we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep that as an understanding. And when you feel disappointed because something didn't work out in your life, Jesus, I'm pretty sure, was disappointed too. Right? But all he does is he stays faithful. Right? Let's look at verse 13 really quickly. Here's where Jesus says, he says this, he who stands firm in the end will be saved. And then he says this, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the entire, all nations basically, all the way to the ends of the earth. So he gives us this heads up, that like, hey, in one generation Jerusalem's going to fall. Nobody knows the answer to the question number 2. But hey, by the way, when everything goes to hell in a handbasket and everything goes to crap, my followers will stand firm. Okay, well, how do I like watch the signs of the time and run for the hills when the armies come and the war breaks out and stand firm? What does it look like to stand firm? And that question in that regard. And here's what as I started studying this throughout this week, I think what Jesus is actually saying is this: can you love God and love others faithfully? Can you live out the ethics of the kingdom that we see in the Sermon on the Mount faithfully? Notice what he doesn't say here. I just want to point this out. He's not saying those who are saved are going to be those who can walk on water. Those who are saved are those who can take scraps of food and perform miracles and feed thousands of people. Those who are saved who can look at somebody who's blind and be like, hey, you can have sight now. What's he say? Stand firm and be faithful. And it seems so simple, doesn't it? But we live in a culture that faithfulness, the idea of standing firm and being faithful and persevering, is completely opposite of our culture of values. We believe that in our culture of values that, like, if you're successful, that means you're following of thousands or millions of people. Right? The idea of showing up to your job every day faithfully is somehow seen as like less than it. Like the image of success sometimes is like literally punching a clock, time card in. And can you do that for 40 years? Can you faithfully provide food and meals for your family? Can you return home knowing that you were faithful to your marriage? Right? Like those are the ideas of success and faithful and biblical values. But in our world values, it looks the complete opposite, doesn't it? And we feel like it has to be something elaborate and something, and Jesus is like, no. If you stand firm and you persevere, that's all you need. Can you love God and can you love others? Can you do that faithfully all the time? Does that mean perfectly? No. You're going to screw that up. And Jesus knows that, right? I just want to let the biblical authors also took this through. And I just want to walk through very quickly. Raj, I'm just going to read those verses if I can. I can't see from there, so I'm going to have to turn around. Did we turn this off? Oh, here we go. So, here's the idea of the perseverance throughout the New Testament. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres, right? I say this at every marriage or wedding ceremony. Let's go to the next one. I persevere in demonstrating to you, this is Paul talking to the Corinthian church again. And so he's talking about, like, I've persevered and I've walked through this. And we talked about this for a while, like 2 years ago, that this church was very good at being bad Christians. And so Paul's like, I've literally persevered with you. Let's go to the next one. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, then you'll save both yourself and your hearers. This is Paul talking to his protege, Timothy. Go to the next one. You need to persevere so that when you have done that God's will and receive what he has promised. This is Hebrews chapter 10. This is a mystery author talking to, we actually don't even know who the audience was either, but you see this again. Let's go to the next one. Same author, same situation. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, and he persevered because he saw him who was invisible. So think about this idea of this rhythm, this theme of like, what is Jesus asking his followers to do? And then his original audience who takes this. And it's not this idea of just like, oh yeah, that's good like words. No, like they actually did this, right? Like the church leaders actually did this. We have a couple more actually. Let's go to the next one. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, the person who received the crown of life, and this is James. This is the half-brother of Jesus, who's picking up the idea of persevering as well, right? Promised to those who loved him, and I think that's it, right, Raj? Sure. 2 more? Go for it. Let's see it. So as you know, we count, bless those who have persevered. You've heard Job's perseverance, and this is go to the next one. Job is this Old Testament character who has a book written out from not a whole lot of great things happened to him. Like it was a lot of trials and stuff like that. And so James is talking to them about like Job persevered through this, and the Lord full of mercy and compassion. Go to the next one. This is Jesus giving the church in Ephesus a compliment, and he's saying like you persevered through this, like you've been faithful to this. One of the only churches who received a compliment from Jesus in those 7 churches. And so the idea of perseverance, it runs throughout the whole New Testament. But for some reason, for us as as followers of Jesus in 2021, the idea of perseverance seems to be slipping. It seems like we expect faithfulness to come right around the corner. Fruitfulness to come right around the corner. And Jesus is like, no, can you just be faithful? Can you just simply stand your ground? Can you love me and love others? Can you live out the ethics of the kingdom, even in the midst of everything in the world going to, like, hitting the fan? Now, if you look at the early church, it's not like they had an American culture society like we have. It was illegal for them to gather and worship Jesus. It was illegal for them to show up at the temple at times. Like, people are being arrested, people are literally being stoned, people are being crucified, it was illegal, it was difficult, and yet they kept persevering, didn't they? And you see the idea of this continually running through. And Jesus tells us, he gives us a heads up in Matthew 24. There's 3 things that's going to happen, right? You're going to have outside pressure, you're going to have persecution to come, you're going to have false prophets that come around saying, hey, I'm the Messiah. And these people are not going to, they're not walking around saying, I am Jesus Christ, but they're saying that I am the anointed one. You know, I don't know if you ever thought about this, I thought about this week. Jesus never called himself Jesus Christ. But yet we refer to him as Jesus Christ all the time. He picks this up in Matthew 24. The only name that he really referred to himself as is the Son of Man. The Son of Man came, and it's a reference that you see in Isaiah and Jeremiah, and then Daniel chapter 7. Daniel from the lion's den has this horrible nightmare. I don't know if you've ever had nightmares that kind of shake you. I don't know how Daniel lived through all the nightmares that he had. But he has this nightmare in Daniel chapter 7 where all these 4 beasts come out, wage war, they're doing all this crazy stuff. And then you see in Matthew chapter 7, this is what he says. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one who was like a son of man. And he approached the Ancient of Days, and I was led into his presence. And the Son of Man was given all authority, glory, sovereign power, and all the nations and the peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom will never be destroyed. That's who Jesus referred to himself as. This seems very contrite and weird, but Mary's last name was not Christ. James's name was not Christ, right? So and there's a whole tangent that I could go down, but I'm not going to because we don't have time for it. But think about it. Mary never walked around and said, "Hey, I'm Mary Christ," or James, I'm James Christ. No, Jesus very intentionally chose this word of "I am the Son of Man," because he wanted people to understand that image, that figure that's been in all Hebrew prophets. That's me. He wasn't hiding anything really. He's telling his followers when everything goes to crap, it's me. And the genre that Matthew 24 and Daniel 7 fall into, this is all Bible nerd stuff, but it's apocalyptic literature. And it's if you ever look at the rise of that kind of stuff, it literally goes in these 70 to 80-year-old swings. Or apocalyptic, that word, literature kind of like gets more popular and it kind of dies down because people are consumed with the end times. It happens in every generation. People like the whole Left Behind, Kirk Cameron stuff, like, and some of you are like, what's that? Great, like you were like too young, bad acting and horrible, whatever, that's fine. We get it, you know. But like the actual word apocalyptic is a Latin word that's derived from Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic things. But we have to understand what the actual meaning of the Hebrew and the Aramaic is. It actually just means revealing. Like Jesus is revealing something to us in this passage. I don't think he's revealing to us, here's the timeline, like the national treasure police to go find this massive treasure. I think he's actually trying to get us to understand, here's the revealing, how I want my followers to respond. Stand your ground, be faithful and firm. But then verse 14, he says this, go preach the gospel. And that word gospel is evangelion, which is the good news of the new king arriving, and he's and reigning and stuff like that. Now, we read this 2,000 years later. We're informed readers. We know that Jerusalem gets destroyed. We know that Rome has this massive war with Jerusalem, and the whole temple treasury gets emptied and stuff like that during this war. We kind of understand that. But imagine the early followers of Jesus. They're like, when Jerusalem falls and the temple is destroyed, be ready. Stand your firm and ground and all that. And then they see the temple fall. They see the war break out. And they go out and do this. Right? And then they go to a place like Rome. And here's a picture of actual stones in Jerusalem today. That these stones are the Temple Mount stones. That are still standing today. They've not removed them. A, because they're massive. And B, because where are they going to put them? So they just leave them there. So you can walk the streets, you can literally see these temple stones that are just been destroyed. As General Titus comes in and from the Roman Empire and just does this. Now imagine, you see the temple being destroyed, so you go out and you stand your firm, you're loving God, you're loving others, you preach the gospel all throughout the Roman Empire, and then you show up to Rome. And you go to this archway right here. And this is the archway of Titus. And you can kind of see this right here in this picture. You see the menorah and stuff like that, and this is Titus literally emptying that temple out, declaring his victory. And as an early follower of Jesus, maybe the second or this third generation of people listening to this, they understand that, man, you cannot mess with Rome. Like, what we thought was untouchable, they literally just annihilated. Do you think the early followers of Jesus in Rome were a little intimidated knowing that even the temple was wiped out? And yet they still kept doing it. They saw the end times happening, they saw everything there, but they stood their ground and they preached the gospel. But they also knew something else, and I just want to walk us through this. We've done this before, but I want us to walk through. They don't walk in their own power. They're not doing anything on their own power. They're not faithful to themselves. They're not like, oh my goodness, I'm so great. Like, no, their confidence and their faithfulness is in Jesus. The early church, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that if we become a follower of Jesus, the old is gone, that like we are new creations. Everything in our previous life is like put to death on the cross, right? Now we are new creations in Christ. So what does the new creation look like? According to Jesus, let's say this is you, right? Nice little stick figure on your toe, right here, just to illustrate it. So if you become a follower of Jesus, according to Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, you now have Jesus in you. Like you are, like the old is dead, and now Jesus lives inside of you. So here's Jesus, right? So we're going to put Jesus inside of you. Here you are, you're walking around. And then let's say you read Colossians 3:3. And you see that Paul is telling us that as we walk around, the old is gone, the new is here. Jesus lives inside of me. But also that now, because of this passage in Colossians 3:3, that now we are now hidden with Christ. So here we are, the new version of us, is that the old is gone, the new is here, so Jesus now lives inside of us, but now I'm hidden with Christ as well. Right? You never, as a follower of Jesus, you are never walking in your own power. And if you do, you're going to fail. But if you walk empowered by Christ, who Christ fills you up, and now you're hidden with Christ, according to this, But Paul also goes on to say this, that hey, you're now hidden with Christ, and you're tucked away with the Father, according to this passage. Do you ever walk on your own? If the old is gone, the new is here. The new version of yourself looks like that Christ lives inside of you, that you live inside of Christ, you're now hidden away with the Father. Now, according to like all the scriptures that we've read through and we've studied as we journey through Matthew, does Jesus keep us from bad situations, or does he keep us safe in situations? In situations, right? So as you love your neighbor as at your workplace, and that person you just can't stand, and you're graciously like, I love you too, like, you're not doing this on your own power. When you don't cuss the person out and cut you off, that's Jesus living inside of you, right? When you don't throw punch people who deserve it, that's Jesus living inside of you. And when things come down your pipeline at work and you're like, I don't know how I'm going to respond to this. Know that you take a stand, and it's Christ inside of you. And when you feel like you're under a spiritual attack, because it's going to happen, you're going to have a spiritual attack of some sort. You're not in your own power. The old is gone. The new is here. When your world falls apart, stand your ground, love God, love others, but know that you're not in your own power. That Christ is in you, you are in Christ, and you're also tucked away with the Father. And you will walk through times where your world falls apart. But be faithful and stand firm. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks for this day. Thanks for everything you've done for us. And the fact that you willingly stepped out of heaven and you stepped into our mess. That you didn't stay isolated, you didn't stay away from us. That you lived among us. And you give us this idea, this warning that, hey, things are going to come. Your world may fall apart. But to stay faithful. To love you and to love others. To live out the ethics of the kingdom. And to continually preach the gospel. And I love the fact that we're never alone. And this is the beauty of knowing the scriptures, all of it. That we see how your original audience and your original leaders lived this out throughout the Roman Empire. And Jesus, we're asking you to do something like this in Maryville and the surrounding areas in 2021. That we would saturate the community with the gospel. As we take this message and we apply it, we live it out, and we just simply walk in the faithfulness of you and your power. And Jesus, very, very personally, there are times and there are things in our lives, in this room right here, where our lives have literally fallen apart. Death is in our families, and divorces, and new life situations, and it just feels like everything is falling apart. So Jesus, we stand and we want to just simply put our trust into you. Our hopes and our dreams are in you and you alone. And you're not leaving us to ourselves, but you are right here with us in the midst of the mess. So Jesus, I pray for comfort and grace in those situations. And for strength and perseverance as we move forward. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name I pray this. Amen. Well, hey, church, I would love to pray with you. If you need prayer for anything, I'll be back at the Green Wall. And whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it alone. Church, I want you to know this with you, that God loves you and that I love you. And as we follow him, we'll count on the best he has to offer for us. So let's go and be the church. See you next week.